It really sucks when 3 of the top 5 quarterbacks in fantasy football are all on bye week. Luckily, there's a lot more options available to us this week than what we had last week. The bad news is it's already week 10 of the fantasy season, and we all need to start making a run to the fantasy playoffs. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing good out there. Today we're talking about quarterbacks. We're going to start and sit here for week 10 fantasy football. Now, before we get into all the matchups, yes, there are timestamps down below. Hit the like button for some timestamps. I got to announce a winner of the signed Ja'Marr Chase rookie card. Let's just go ahead and do that first, because I know a lot of people have been excited about this card. So we have randomly selected a winner. There were a ton of comments on that video. The winner is Kyle Cameron 1908. Congratulations. You are the winner of the signed Ja'Marr Chase rookie card. Hopefully you have your free Pristine account signed up using that referral code Headliners. And if so, send me an email to info@thefantasyheadliners.com so I can get you hooked up. We got more giveaways coming up as well. So be sure to have that account signed up at pristineauction.com using referral code Headliners. Pull up that 10-minute auction throughout the day. I'm telling you right now, the deals are getting better and better, and it's not just football jerseys. They have everything you can possibly think of, so be sure to check it out. And then secondly, I know there's a lot of stress out there. There's some anxiety out there. I feel it, right? I just feel it because everybody wants to make that run to the fantasy playoffs. So the air feels heavier. I sense it on YouTube. I sense it on Discord. And trust me, I'm feeling the same way. And I understand that sometimes when you get a little bit stressed about your fantasy football team, it leads to a few extracurricular activities, maybe a couple more 12-ounce curls on Sundays. I totally understand. But the last thing I want is for that extracurricular activity to affect your production on Monday at work. When the new week starts, I gotta be sharp. I gotta be on top of my game. I want you to be as well. And that's why you get some, dude, Waterboy, I have heard nothing but great feedback about this stuff since we started promoting it here on the channel. Great comments all over the place. It has 0 sugar, 0 caffeine, only 10 calories, and 3 times the electrolytes as its main competitor. It's something that can rehydrate you, get rid of some nausea, calm your anxiety a little bit, and has a boost of vitamins to knock out any fatigue. All it takes is 1 packet. And people put packets like this in their water and stuff all the time. What flavors we got here? Strawberry lemonade, blue raspberry, grape. All you gotta do is take one of these packets in like 32 ounces of cold water, and you are on your way to recovery. But the last thing that I want is for you to pay full price. You know we're all about giving back to the people here. So this is what you have to do. Head over to waterboy.com/headliners. Yes, there is a link down below in the description. Follow that link. Find yourself a flavor that you like, and then you're gonna get 15% off your order because we sent you there. Don't waste any more time. Get on the road to recovery right now. www.waterboy.com/headliners. Links down below in the description. But now is the time when everybody wants to talk about football. So let's go ahead, kick it off Thursday night with a real doozy of a matchup. The Carolina Panthers and Chicago Bears. Now, we may have to drink during this game. And let's just start off in Carolina, right? Because Bryce Young continues to be set up to fail. He has no time in the pocket whatsoever, and that really leads to him not having anything consistent open up down the field. He just had a season low in air yards per attempt of 1.49 yards. People, that's less than 6 feet of air time under a football during a pass. That is no bueno. At this point, I think I would almost prefer single-ply toilet paper over the offensive line of the Carolina Panthers. Poor Bryce Young now has been sacked at least 4 times in 5 of his last 6 games played. Teams are blitzing him like crazy because they know they can't protect him. Only 1 game all year in which he scored over 14.5 fantasy points, and he's the current quarterback 26 overall in fantasy. But now he gets a matchup going up against Chicago, and on paper, they allow 19.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, all while having the 5th best run defense in the NFL. You have to throw on Chicago. And it really doesn't help Bryce Young that all of his weapons aren't even healthy, right? DJ Chark, Laviska Shenault, they're both questionable to play here in week 10. We all know that Bryce Young can throw the football. That is not the question here. It's all about the protection, and we just haven't seen him protected all season long. Now, on paper, this is a pretty good matchup for Bryce Young, But in fantasy football, I am sure hoping you have better options. But on the other side of the football, let's go ahead and talk about Tyson Bagent one more time, because as of right now, Justin Fields still limited and really unsure whether or not he's going to play here on Thursday. If I had to guess, probably not at this point. So we'll go ahead and we'll keep talking about Tyson, because this guy just faced a pretty solid New Orleans defense just last week, and he scored more points last week than Patrick Mahomes, Tua Tagovailoa, Lamar Jackson, and Justin Herbert. How is that even possible, though? Did you watch the game? The guy was a turnover machine. 4 turnovers, including 3 interceptions. But what really gave him the good game overall, he had 70 yards rushing. And that's going to help cover up a lot of bad quarterback games if you're able to rush for that many yards. His previous high this season, though, was 24. So it's not like we can really rely on 70 yards rushing every single week. Now a matchup going up against Carolina. They allow 14.4 fantasy points per game. That is 7th fewest in the league to opposing quarterbacks. Offensive guard Nate Davis and tight end Cole Kmet both questionable for this matchup, but there is some good news in Chicago. Running back Khalil Herbert, he's back. He's listed as a full participant on Monday. We could see his return here super soon. Now, I love watching Tyson Bagent play football, but like I just said, we can't count on 70 yards rushing every single week, and that paired with all the turnovers we've seen here as of late, I'm sure there are a lot safer options out there as well, instead of just riding the lightning of Tyson Bagent. But I know there's a lot of people out there super pumped for the primetime matchup of Bryce Young and Tyson Bagent. But now we're going to head over to New England for the Patriots and the Colts. We'll kick it off with the Indianapolis Colts and Gardner Minshew, who really knows all about that Carolina defense we were just mentioning in the previous matchup, because he just had his worst game of the season against them last week, where he threw for only 127 yards passing, 1 touchdown, and no interceptions. They got the win thanks to the Colts defense. But really similar to Bryce Young, Gardner Minshew couldn't get the ball down the field last week consistently. He only averaged 3.3 air yards per pass attempt, so not very far down the field. His previous low on the season was 5.2 air yards per attempt, but typically he's hovering right around that 7-yard mark. Now that right there is what really leads to the low production in the passing game. But now they get a matchup going up against New England, who allows 15.9 fantasy points per game, right around league average. However, they have allowed over 260 yards passing now in 3 of their last 4 games played. But when we really think about Gardner Minshew for fantasy football here this week, a lot of eyes are on rookie wide receiver Josh Downs, who's currently battling through a knee injury and is questionable to play, alongside offensive tackle Braden Smith, also questionable to play, and they would love to have both of those guys available here in Week 10. Now, New England, they aren't what they used to be. I think everyone knows that, but it's not an easy place just to stroll into and just dominate. When you look at Gardner Minshew, he's more of a mid to high-end quarterback 2 here for me this week for all of you who play in 2 quarterback leagues. All right, now let's talk about Mac Jones and the New England Patriots. And let me start off by saying this for Mac Jones. The matchup that he had last week, it's not going to get much easier going forward, right? Because when you're going up against that Washington Commandos defense, you're probably in line for a pretty good game. And in Mac Jones standards, he didn't have a bad game, right? But he still only finished as quarterback 16 overall. Had 220 yards passing, 1 touchdown, and 1 interception. And honestly, it has everything to do with the exact reason we talked about in this show last week. There are just not enough offensive weapons in New England to give Mac Jones much more of a ceiling than around quarterback 16 or so weekly. He's a mid quarterback 2 in decent matchups. That's just where he sits right now. Everyone thought that Demario Douglas was going to come in and be like Randy Moss or something, but we tried to warn you all to temper your expectations. The guy is a solid wide receiver, but you also have to remember, even though Kendrick Bourne went down, Pop Douglas got more of an opportunity, he's also going to get more defensive attention, and that matters. But now he gets a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow 16.4 fantasy points per game, so a little bit more than what New England allows, but we're really waiting to find out whether or not we're going to have Devontae Parker back this week for Mac Jones. He missed the game last week with a concussion. Can he clear this week? Aside from that, though, it's really just the offensive line. They're basically a walking ace bandage at this point. But just like any other quarterback in the NFL, Mac Jones could go out and have a top 12 day. We've seen it with guys all year long, but 70% of the time, he's going to hover right around that quarterback 15 to 25 range and hurt you more than he helps you, and that's why he continues to be a risk in starting him week in and week out in fantasy football. Which will then take us out to Baltimore for a great matchup between the Cleveland Browns and Baltimore Ravens. We'll kick it off in Cleveland, and I sure hope people are actually listening to this and not just scrolling through and looking at graphics. There are still people out there that think the names colored in red equals a sit, and that is so not the case. It really has everything to do about risk, and there's a lot of it here in this matchup. These two teams are two of the top 3 overall defenses in the NFL. Now, last week, it was great to see Deshaun Watson come back and look a lot better than the last time we saw him on the field. 219 yards passing, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, 22 yards rushing. But try to remember, that was against the worst team in the NFL, the Arizona Cardinals. This matchup is going to be a little bit different. Baltimore only allows 11.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is lowest in the NFL. They've allowed less than 200 yards passing in 3 of their last 4 ball games and have forced 11 turnovers over their last 6 games. And we all know the offensive line in Cleveland is getting pretty banged up in that pass rush. The pressure of Baltimore is going to be there this week. Now, for Deshaun Watson, he did not play in their first matchup of the season back in week 4. However, over his career, he does not have one game with multiple touchdowns against the Baltimore Ravens. He's not a locked-in starter for me here this week. Not in this matchup. He's maybe a little bit more top 18 than he is top 20 for me in my rankings this week. How about Lamar Jackson? And right now, Lamar Jackson is suffering from being on a really good football team. They have outscored their opponents 106 to 33 over the last 3 weeks of the season. Lamar is just not having to throw the ball very much because they always have a huge lead. Now, fantasy-wise, that sucks. But on the other hand, when Lamar has to throw the ball, he's a top 3 fantasy quarterback, so he's basically locked into your lineup each and every week. But I get the back-to-back games of only right around 12 fantasy points or so have absolutely sucked. Now a matchup going up against Cleveland again, though. They allow 12.7 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, which is second fewest in the league. However, these two faced off back in week 4, like I mentioned. Did you see what Lamar Jackson did in that game on the road in Cleveland? He had 4 total touchdowns, was the quarterback 4 overall on the week. Now he gets to go home and play in Baltimore against a team that he's already found huge success in. If this game can stay close at all, once again, we're locking in Lamar Jackson. Which will take us out to Cincinnati for the Bengals and the Texans, and kind of what seems to be a lock for 2 top 12 quarterbacks here in week 10. We'll start off with CJ Stroud and the Houston Texans, because after 3 weeks of meh performances, CJ Stroud just went the hell off. 470 yards passing, 5 touchdowns, no interceptions against Tampa Bay in week 9. He was the quarterback 1 overall in fantasy football for the week. He had only had 5 passing touchdowns in the entire month of October. He now has 5 passing touchdowns through 1 week of November. Last week in this video right here, we said that if Houston wanted a chance to win, they were going to have to throw and throw a lot, and throw they did. Over 40 pass attempts in a game for the first time since week 2, and I really don't know why that isn't their plan each and every week. Just do what works. Your running game absolutely sucks in Houston. You have a stud quarterback. Throw the football like that every single week. Now they get a matchup going up against Cincinnati. They allow over 17.5 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, 12th most in the league. I would really love to see a CJ Stroud, Joe Burrow shootout. They don't have Robert Woods, more than likely. He's still questionable to play, but doesn't really matter. They don't really even need him. The hardest thing really for me to understand in this offense is the sporadic usage of Tank Dell. When they involve him, good things happen, especially for CJ Stroud. But Tank Dell had 11 targets total in his 3 previous games combined. He then had 11 targets alone in just week 9, and we saw what CJ Stroud did. He is a huge part of the ceiling of CJ Stroud, and I hope they continue to show him that usage each and every week. How about for Joe Burrow? The Bengals have finally started winning ball games. They have now won 4 straight, including games over the likes of Buffalo and San Francisco, and it really has everything to do with the health of Joe Burrow. 4 straight games now with multiple touchdown passes, completing 75% of his passes over the last month of the season. Oh yeah, it really helps that T. Higgins is finally back and healthy as well. He is a huge part of this offense. But there is a little bit of a cause for concern here in Cincinnati. It's the health of Ja'Marr Chase. We saw him come down hard on his back in that week 9 game, and he was really never the same after that. He is probably one of the biggest names we're monitoring here throughout the week because he's still technically day to day. Now, we would love to have him in this matchup going up against Houston. They allow 16.8 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but do we see Ja'Marr Chase get a little bit of rest in this game? Do they need him in this offense to beat Houston? Because they have to keep winning games in Cincinnati. After their slow start to the season, they can't afford to just say, you know what, we'll give it our best shot. If we lose, we lose. No, you got to keep winning if you're the Bengals. And this is why I just said a little bit earlier why it was so huge to have a healthy T. Higgins back. Because if they don't have Ja'Marr Chase and you still have T. Higgins, Tyler Boyd, letting Irv swerve out there, Irv Smith, that's still enough to have on the field to give Joe Burrow a solid fantasy day once again in a game in which they're probably going to have to throw the ball quite a bit. Obviously, I don't mind CJ Stroud or Joe Burrow here in week 10. Down to Florida we go now for the Jacksonville Jaguars, San Francisco 49ers, 2 teams coming off their bye weeks and hopefully a little bit fresher. We'll kick it off here with Brock Purdy because the bye week could not have come at a better time. San Francisco was struggling. They have lost their last 3 games and injuries were starting to pile up on both sides of the football. Brock Purdy only has 3 touchdowns total over his last 3 games played to go along with 7 turnovers in that same span. Brock hadn't had an interception all year long up until the last 3 games of the season. So what is it that's going on in San Francisco? Because now they have a matchup going up against Jacksonville. They allow 16.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, and they are way easier to throw on than they are to run on. But really, it all has to do with injuries, and the 2 that are out there that are affecting Brock Purdy the most have to be wide receiver Deebo Samuel and all-world offensive tackle Trent Williams. Now, reports out there right now are saying that both of these guys have a chance to be back this week, and that would be huge for Brock Purdy. Now, due to the poor play here over the last few weeks of the season, a lot of people have bailed off the Purdy bandwagon, but this team is too good, this offense is too good, and they're going to get a little bit healthier, that I'm looking for a bounce back here this week from Brock Purdy in this matchup against Jacksonville. He will be inside my top 12 quarterbacks on the week. What about for Jacksonville and Trevor Lawrence? And I'm not going to lie, I'm a little bit excited to see what the Jacksonville Jaguars can do here the second half of the season because they got super hot before their bye week. They've won 5 straight ball games. Now, no, it wasn't all because of Trevor Lawrence, though. We got to be honest about it, right? He's currently the quarterback 17 overall on the season, averaging 15.6 fantasy points per game. Only has 1 game all year in which he scored under 15 fantasy points. So the dude's floor is super safe. Problem is, he's only had 2 games all season over 18 fantasy points, so his ceiling has been pretty low as well, and that's really the biggest problem with Trevor Lawrence. Now, it doesn't sound like they're going to have Zay Jones back this week either, so that's definitely something to pay attention to. In this matchup going up against San Francisco, they allow only 13.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. That is 9th fewest in the league, but their defense has been riddled with injuries. This is never going to be some cream puff matchup, though, and now we know during their bye week, they added Chase Young to that pass rush. That does not make things any easier. This one right here is going to be solely reliant on the usage of Calvin Ridley. Now, I know when I say that name, so many people are like, and I totally understand that. But what happens when Calvin Ridley is used is we see the ceiling of Trevor Lawrence. For whatever reason, they've just used him as a little bit more of a decoy here to start the season in 2023. Can they release him here in the second half? If they do, and they really turn him into a consistent weapon, Trevor Lawrence could go on a run here second half of the season and help carry people to the fantasy playoffs. As of right now, though, he's going to be a Verge top 12 option for me in what I still expect to be a difficult matchup, even though it's at home. which will now take us out to Minnesota for the Vikings and the Saints. Will kick it off on New Orleans side of the football on Derek Carr, who has had 4 straight games now over 16.5 fantasy points, yet people still hate him in fantasy football, and I really don't understand why. As a bye week fill-in, as an injury replacement, you really can't ask for much more than Derek Carr. He's thrown for over 300 yards in 3 of his last 4 ball games. He's had multiple touchdown passes now in back-to-back weeks, and finally, he was able to complete 75% of his passes to Chris Olave, which is something he needed to do in our video here last week. Now they get a matchup going up against Minnesota. They allow 17.4 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but the team has really started playing a little bit better here over the last month of the season. Now they have some of that emotional momentum that you know I like to talk about. It truly makes a difference on the football field. With the studs that we have this week on bye and a few of the other quarterbacks in the NFL with some tough matchups, I really don't hate Derek Carr once again this week. When Carr has time in the pocket, usually good things happen. He's only been sacked 4 times now over the last month of the season, and that's why we're starting to see some good things happen. I'll have Derek Carr just outside of my top 12. His opponent, Josh Dobbs. And Josh Dobbs is basically the equivalent this year of last year's Geno Smith. He's bounced around his whole career, but when given a chance in 2023, the guy's been nothing but solid. The guy just won a game in Minnesota without even knowing their offense, really. He is super smart. He continues to show that he has that rushing upside that we talked about when he was in Arizona here to start the season, but he just had a season-high 66 yards rushing, back-to-back games now with 3 total touchdowns while playing for different teams. I don't know if people realize how mind-blowing that really is, but now he gets a matchup going up against New Orleans. They allow 15.3 fantasy points per game, and they have forced turnovers in every single game this season, including 5 of them just last week against Chicago. Now, we know about Jaren Hall, right? He left with a concussion. That's what gave Josh Dobbs the opportunity to begin with, so he's in concussion protocol. KJ Osborne, he's currently in concussion protocol as well. Cam Akers, we saw him tear his Achilles. He's done for the year. But we also have TJ Hawkinson, who's dealing with a rib injury. Now, the reports have come out that they hope that he can play through it here this week, but that is definitely a big one to pay attention to as well. Josh freaking Dobbs, as of right now, is quarterback 10 overall in fantasy football, and no one out there wants to start him. He's averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game. If all of his weapons are healthy, if he has TJ Hawkinson, if he has KJ Osborne, this guy is not going to be far outside of my top 12 once again. I know it's not a sexy name that a lot of people want to talk about, but if you have a quarterback on a bye week, Josh Dobbs has been playing too freaking well for too freaking long for everybody to continue to ignore him. Can you just imagine what this guy could do once he actually learns the playbook? Over to Pittsburgh now for the Steelers and Packers. Will start off in Green Bay and Jordan Love, and unfortunately, I think we reached that point in Jordan Love's season where you really don't want to have to start him anymore, and some may say, it's been like that all year. I don't want to start Jordan Love, but he really started off the season pretty good fantasy-wise. He had multiple touchdown games in 5 of his first 6 games of the season, and he was a top 12 overall quarterback through 7 weeks of this year. But they just can't seem to get anything going consistently in the passing game. Christian Watson, he's either hurt or invisible. Romeo Doubs and Jaden Reed, they're barely seeing 4 targets a game. And now they're going up against Pittsburgh. They allow only 15.4 fantasy points per game, really more of a bend but not break type passing defense. We know that Christian Watson is hurt once again, dealing with a back/chest injury. He's questionable not whether he'll even suit up in week 10. And this is already a team that is fighting to protect Jordan Love. He has been sacked 8 times now over the last 2 games of the season, and now they have to worry about TJ Watt. He is more of a low-end quarterback 2 for me here this week, more of a top 20 option. I'll say that. What about Kenny Pickett, though? And I'm sorry to all the Steelers fans out there, but I gotta say it. This dude just ain't it. He's a serviceable starter in the NFL, but he's not a franchise guy, and he's not going to lead you to Super Bowls. He has a hard enough time just leading you to a touchdown, much less a Super Bowl. He only has 1 passing touchdown in the entire month of October. Just 1 in an entire month. He's only had one game all year long with multiple touchdowns. That was way back in week 3 against the Raiders. They refused to use George Pickens every single week. Now he's pissed off. The dude is already a diva to begin with, and now he's starting to get vocal about it. That's not a good sign. Then they get a matchup going up against Green Bay. They only allow 13.9 fantasy points per game, one of the top pass defenses in the NFL. They are way easier to run on. And when you look at the game of Kenny Pickett overall this season, he hasn't had one game all year in which he finished top 12 at the position. He has only 7 total touchdowns on the year. We're getting ready to head into week 10. He's not running on the ground, so he provides no rushing upside. There is just nothing to see in his game right now that makes me want to go, should probably start him. Out to Tampa now for the Bucs and the Titans, and I am ready to go on the record and say that Will Levis needs to be the starting quarterback for the Tennessee Titans for the remainder of the season. Now sure, his second game that we just saw in week 9 was a huge step down from what we saw in his NFL debut in week 8, but we kind of knew that, right? We expected that to somewhat happen. He's moving the ball down the field though through the air and making plays that show flashes of what his potential could definitely be here in the NFL. He has shown more to me in 2 weeks than I have seen from Kenny Pickett in 2 years. But it's going to be a work in progress. The consistency just isn't going to be there for right now. And we understand that he doesn't have a whole lot of weapons at his disposal. Now he's going up against Tampa Bay. They allow over 20.5 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, and we just saw CJ Stroud own this defense in week 9. Now we also know that Treylon Burks, he's currently in concussion protocol, and he may miss this game along with several offensive linemen. Will Levis, though, is going to remain a huge fantasy risk until he can get more reps and become a little bit more consistent. As a second quarterback, though, in 2 quarterback leagues, I don't hate it this week. I love the potential upside that this kid brings to the table, especially in a matchup against a defense that has shown that they can be vulnerable through the air. Now, no, he's not going to be inside my top 12. Inside my top 20? Probably. What about his opponent, Baker Mayfield, who continues to basically put on a bake show? And I feel the same way about Baker as I kind of do about Josh Dobbs. The guy's playing so well, but nobody wants to start him in fantasy football. He now has 17 plus fantasy points in 4 of his last 5 games played. He's averaging just under 17 fantasy points per game, only has 4 interceptions total on the season. He also now has multiple touchdowns in back-to-back ball games, a solid pass-catching running back in the backfield, a young tight end that's starting to get more involved in this offense each and every week, and 2 stud wide receivers in Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. I know it isn't always pretty with Baker Mayfield, but we want fantasy points, and I don't care how he gets them. But now they get a matchup going up against Tennessee, and they allow only 14.8 fantasy points per game. That is 8th fewest in the league, but that number is skewed slightly because their last 2 ball games have been against Taylor Heineke and said Kenny Pickett. Now we know in Tampa this offensive line isn't 100% healthy and the running game is inefficient to say the least. What does that mean? It means they're going to have to throw the ball again. Now Baker may not be the safest quarterback in fantasy football each and every week, but everything he has and the way he's played here over the last few weeks, he's not going to be very far out of my top 12 quarterbacks here in week 10. Which will now take us out to Arizona for the Cardinals and the Falcons, and for Atlanta we got Taylor Gimme a Heineke here once more, and as the losses continue to rack up for the Atlanta Falcons, I'm just hoping that we're getting closer and closer to the end of the Arthur Smith era in Atlanta. The lack of usage of his top weapons is one of the dumbest things I've seen in like 20 years of fantasy football. He acts like he has some process, and then he goes out and gets beat by a quarterback that's been on the team for like 2 days and doesn't even know a playbook. Give me a break with the process. It does sound, though, like Taylor Heineke is going to remain the starter here in Atlanta for right now, and he really hasn't been that bad. He's averaging 14 fantasy points per game, and he didn't even have Drake London last week. Now he gets a great matchup going up against Arizona. They allow 18.6 fantasy points per game, 8th most in the league, but it really seems here as of late that teams are finding so much success on the ground against Arizona that they're really not having to throw the ball very much. In fact, Arizona's defense has allowed over 110 yards rushing in 7 of the 9 games they've played this season. Now, when it comes to injuries, Mac Hollins is questionable to play. That's definitely something worth paying attention to, but it does sound like Drake London will be back in the lineup here this week. I love the potential here for Taylor Heinicke to have a solid fantasy day, but I also don't trust Arthur Smith at all because he could definitely go out there, give Tyler Algier 25 carries, and totally handcuff this passing offense again. I think the one thing that we can all agree on here with the Atlanta offense is it doesn't matter what we think. Nothing is safe with Arthur Smith as your head coach. How about Kyler Murray? That's right, the return of Kyler Murray in week 10 of the fantasy football season. Now, we all know that a healthy Kyler Murray is basically a weekly must-start guy. And I honestly don't hate starting him here this week, but do I think it's a safe start? Probably not. It's going to be his first time on the field starting since week 14 of last year. How is he going to be utilized with this coaching staff? Remember, last year he was with Cliff Kingsbury, arguing on the sideline. Now he gets a new head coach and new coaching staff in Jonathan Gannon. We already saw some of that rushing upside with Josh Dobbs earlier in the season, and you have to expect that that's just going to be a part of Kyler Murray's game once again to help boost up our floor each and every week. But you also got to think that the Cardinals have nothing to lose, right? They're the worst team in the NFL, so why not go out there and let her rip? Now in a matchup going up against Atlanta, they allow 18.8 fantasy points per game, 7th most in the league. Sounds like we could be getting back James Conner in the backfield as well. The offensive line is hurting. 3 current offensive linemen questionable to play in this matchup. Now, if you look at your matchup in fantasy football this week and you feel like you're going to be chasing your opponent, maybe you don't feel like you can play it safe, that's when I gamble on Kyler Murray. In his first game back, though, I am not going to sit a proven producer at the quarterback position to throw in Kyler Murray. If you're looking for an example, Jared Goff, right? I would start Jared Goff over Kyler Murray here this week. A proven quarterback here in 2023 with a great matchup. I'll take that safety and that ceiling over the gamble of Kyler Murray. But like I said, it's really going to have to do a lot with your matchup here this week. You have to expect there's going to be a little bit of rust there with Kyler Murray, and it's not like he's overly surrounded with a ton of weapons. I do love the connection between him and Marquise Hollywood Brown. We know about Rondale Moore, Michael Wilson, a little bit banged up right now as well, but there's definitely enough to give Kyler a decent floor. I'm just not going to go out in his very first game back and expect a ceiling game. Now we head back out to LA, though, for the Chargers and the Lions, one of the best matchups here of the week. Looking forward to this game. And we'll start off with Jared Goff. And coming off the bye week, this is going to be a great opportunity for Jared Goff to start off hot second half of the season. He's the current quarterback, 12 overall, averaging 17.9 fantasy points per game, but he's had kind of a couple bad games leading into the bye week. The 2 games prior to the bye only had 1 total touchdown combined in those games. But give a little bit of credit to the defenses he faced in both Baltimore and an underrated defense in Las Vegas. This one against LA, though, could for sure be a different story because the Chargers allow almost 21 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, the most in the league. And that number may not even be high enough. Why? Because their last 2 games were against Tyson Bagent and Zach Wilson. There's also a chance that this offense could get back David Montgomery as well, and teams have not been able to stop Amon-Ra St. Brown almost the entire season. Plus Jahmyr Gibbs, he's earned a larger role in this offense, that big playability. Sam Laporta, one of the best tight ends there is in fantasy football, and a great matchup. I absolutely love myself some Jared Goff here this week. What about Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers? And I know so many people needed so much more from Herbert in week 9. But at least that struggle came against one of the best pass defenses in the NFL. It's not like he went out there and struggled against some cream puff defense last week. Plus, the drops didn't help either. He's still the quarterback 7 overall, averaging 20 fantasy points per game, has had at least 19 fantasy points now in all but 2 games this season. Quentin Johnston was out there getting locked down by Sauce Gardner. We know that Josh Palmer went to the IR prior to the game, and Austin Eckler just seemed to struggle holding on to the football. There were a few potential first downs that he could have gained to really extend some drives that did not happen due to drops. Now they get a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow 15.2 fantasy points per game to quarterbacks, but they're also the second best run defense in the NFL. Now, Justin Herbert has had multiple touchdowns in every home game this year, and if that Detroit offense can score like we think that they're going to be able to, we could see Justin Herbert having to throw the ball a lot, especially if they have to deal with that Detroit run defense. Justin Herbert also going to be a guy inside my top 10 this week. Out to Dallas now, though, for the Cowboys and the Giants, and we won't waste any time talking about Tommy DeVito. There ain't nobody in fantasy football contemplating whether or not they should play Tommy DeVito against Dallas on the road. The answer, No. Hate to see what happened to Daniel Jones. He's done for the year, but enjoy the waiver wire forever, Tommy DeVito. What about Dak Prescott, though? I'm very interested in starting Dak Prescott here in fantasy football because he is absolutely killing it right now. He's had at least 24 fantasy points over his last 3 games played and is all the way up to quarterback 11 overall on the season. He's had 3+ touchdowns now in back-to-back ball games, completing over 70% of his passes, and now he gets a chance to go home to Dallas against another division opponent, a team in which they absolutely romped back in week 1, 40-0. Not really because of Dak Prescott. That was a horrible rain game and was overly dominated by the defense. But now in this matchup going up against the Giants, they allow 14.3 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks, but their last 2 games were against Aiden O'Connell and Zach Wilson, so that number could be a little bit higher. Not a horrible passing defense, though, in New York, I will say that, but it's no coincidence that Dak Prescott started to perform better in fantasy when he started to target CeeDee Lamb more. Over that 3-game hot streak of Dak, CeeDee Lamb has had at least 115 yards receiving and is averaging 12 targets per game. I expect a lot of the same to happen here once again, and I don't mind throwing Dak Prescott into my starting lineup. Now we head up to Seattle for the Seahawks and the Washington Commandos, and how crazy is it that Sam Howell has had at least 16 fantasy points in all but 2 games this season, and 3 of those games, he was over 21 fantasy points. I really see no reason for that to slow down now. Their bad defense got even worse last week when they shipped off Montez Sweat and Chase Young. They allow the 3rd most points in the NFL, so they're always having to keep their foot on the gas. The Washington run game is basically non-existent, and Sam Howell is out there throwing the ball 40+ times a week, which has led to over 300 yards passing in 3 of the last 5 ball games. Now we get some matchup going up against Seattle. They allow almost 17 fantasy points per game, right around league average or so to opposing quarterbacks. Curtis Samuel, he's still questionable, but I really don't know what took this team so long to commit more volume to Jahan Dotson. His uptick in usage over the last 2 games has helped Sam Howell a ton. He's the current quarterback 6 overall, and he's going to remain in a lot of fantasy lineups once again here this week. His opponent, Geno Smith. And don't be too concerned with his performance from week 9. We kind of expected that, didn't we? He was going against Baltimore, and I had him ranked outside my top 15 for a reason. But this one right here, now it's time for redemption for those Geno Smith owners. You always start the quarterbacks against the Washington Commandos. Geno hasn't been anything close to his 2022 form here in 2023. However, 2 of his last 3 games played are 2 of his best games of the year. Even Mac Jones had a top 16 finish against this defense, and he did it without his top 2 wide receivers on offense. Washington allows almost 21 fantasy points per game, second most in the league. The pass-catching weapons have gotten healthier in Seattle, and even though Geno isn't going to be some top 12 option week in and week out until he can prove a little bit more consistency, this matchup right here is absolutely perfect for those of you looking for a bye week fill-in, an injury replacement, and a Verge top 15 quarterback once again here in week 10. Which will take us out to Las Vegas for the Raiders and the Jets. And every once in a while, you have a matchup between 2 teams that have 2 quarterbacks that just aren't fantasy viable. I mean, come on, there ain't nobody out there starting Zach Wilson or Aiden O'Connell in week 10 of fantasy football. Sure, there's some studs on by, but there's a lot of other options, a lot of safer options than these 2. So consider this me giving you back a couple minutes of time. I could take 4 minutes here and really break down these 2 guys just to say at the very end, we ain't starting either one of them in fantasy football. Which will take us to Monday Night Football, a matchup of the Buffalo Bills, Denver Broncos. We'll kick it off with Denver, and fresh off the bye week, does that mean that we automatically throw Russell Wilson into our starting lineups? I mean, so far on the season, he's quarterback 15 overall and averaging just over 17 fantasy points per game. And really, a lot of that has to do with the slight uptick in that rushing upside here as of late. He's had at least 20 yards rushing in 4 straight ball games, plus multiple passing touchdowns in 5 of the 8 games he's played this season. Now they come off the bye week where they had an extra week to prep for this Buffalo Bills defense, which as of right now is only allowing 14.2 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. But we all know that defense is hurting for certain in Buffalo. But all that aside, it's still going to be primetime football on the road in Buffalo. And that's not easy, right? I can't look at Russell Wilson though and say, hey, he's a bad start this week. I do believe there's guys out there that I like more, like Sam Howell, even Geno Smith, as higher options that I would rather start this week. When I look at Russell Wilson, I see of him more as a top 15 option and not a top 10 to 12 option. What about Josh Allen, the #1 overall quarterback in fantasy football? I think we should start him here this week. He's averaging 24.4 fantasy points per game and has only scored under 22 fantasy points one time since week 1. He's had rushing touchdowns in 6 of his last 7 ball games. Multiple passing touchdowns in 6 out of 9 games this season. Now he's going up against Denver that allows over 17 fantasy points per game to opposing quarterbacks. With this defense being as banged up as it is, it's leading to Josh Allen having to keep his foot on the pedal for all 4 quarters, which is absolute fantasy gold. More than likely, Josh Allen can be my #1 quarterback in week 10. All right, that's going to do it for my quarterback start and sit video here for week 10 fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you a little bit of information to make your decisions a little bit easier. If I did, do me a favor before you leave. Hit the like button and consider subscribing if you haven't already. We're into the double-digit weeks, and that's when it's time to make a run at the fantasy playoffs, and we would love to do it alongside you. But for now, I'm going to get out here for the day. Hopefully you enjoy the rest of your day, and then do your part to make the world a better place.